Welcome to Understanding the Bible, the Story of a Book, with Greg Salyer. For this lecture, we're talking about the Bible in its mediums, because the medium is the meaning. So what do we mean by that? Well, there are technologies in the world, of course, tools that help us to manipulate nature. The greatest of these tools is actually language. And it is not a natural tool in the sense that it is limited to our biology, although some linguists would argue that. Rather, it is a tool that we developed over time, just like thinking, actually. And so we have a variety of technologies of thinking, which are, in fact, ways of communicating. And we'll get into this a bit more in a minute. But for now, just simply try to imagine thinking without words. I suppose you could do it. Perhaps infants do this, but we'll never know. Why will we never know? Because they don't have words to convey what they're thinking. Some artists would argue that you can think without words, you can think through images, and that may well be. If so, that is a minor feature of thinking, a minor form of thinking, because most of our thinking involves words. Let me tell you a true story. You find this in Charles Eastman's book, The Soul of the Indian. A missionary came to the Seneca in upstate New York with his message of the gospel. The Black Coat said, there was a time in the beginning in a garden where everything was perfect, except the first humans there sinned, disobeyed God, and God therefore sent his son in order to die in the place of humanity for anyone who chose to believe in him. The Seneca say, cool, let us tell you a story about the origin of corn. So they tell one of their creation myths about the origin of corn, which is in fact life for people, the Seneca and the other people who depended upon agriculture back then. The missionary is confused, then angry, then furious. And he says, what I gave you was the truth, and you responded with mere fable and falsehood with this story about the origin of corn. The Seneca now are confused, but they don't get angry. They just don't understand. And they say, we believed your story. Why won't you believe ours? And there it is right there. We believed your story. Why won't you believe ours? Well, I hope in the remainder of this lecture to show you just how that story emerged and what it means. It's a very parable-like story, and it's ultimately a story about orality and literacy. Because the missionary had a book, he thought there was one true story. Because the Seneca did not, they had an oral culture. They lived in orality. They knew that the more stories, the better. And what this really means is that the medium is the meaning. So the Seneca were able to find meaning in a story that was not their own because it was a story, and they recognized it as a story. The Jesuit who came to them could not find meaning in their story because he was trapped by a book, by literacy. All right? So again, language is the medium of thinking. You can only with great difficulty have a thought without words, so much so that it's not really worth talking about. In fact, you can't talk about it, right? because you can't use words. Language is the medium of thinking. It is our most powerful and prevalent technology. The medium of the language, therefore, determines different kinds of thinking. Now, this is where I'm going to need you to stay with me. There's been a lot of research done on this, but it's not surfaced in popular culture. I guess it wouldn't. But it's incredibly important. In fact, I think it's the most significant change in human history, is the change between the technologies of thinking, that it's the way we use language, the medium of the language, because each medium creates a different reality. The kinds of thinking, the kinds of mediums we are using are in fact different ways of being and knowing. Let me say that again. Different ways of being, of existing, not to mention knowing. Now, what does this have to do with the Bible? Because every bit of the Bible as we have it was born in orality, not literacy. We look back through literacy at the Bible, and that is, like the Bible itself, the product of many years of evolution and change. And therefore, it is not where the Bible was born. In fact, we can't get to where the Bible was born because it was born in orality, which disappears once it's spoken. So, a way of thinking about this is mythos and logos. And we find the pivot point here, as we do so often in Western culture, with Plato. Plato's an interesting cat here because he's on the edge of literacy becoming prominent among the elite in ancient Greece, writing, that is, and he hates it. He despises it. He warns people against it, and he uses it deftly. And so here's the inherent paradox of writing, is that it contains orality. It contains mythos, but it uses logos. So mythos is the Greek word for myth, and it means story. It means a lot of things. Etymologically, it actually is related to the word mother, or that which comes from the mouth, mythos, meaning orality, right? Storytelling. Logos, as you probably know, is the word that means a lot of different things. In Christianity, it's the word for word, which is God and is with God and was God. It's also the more prosaic meaning of just the study of. So it's the word in biology, psychology, etc. Mythos is story, that's which of the mouth. Logos is of the word, of the written word in particular. So we get logos, we get our rationality through mythos, and we still are in mythos. I don't want to paint this as two separate ways of being. They are interrelated and they're simultaneous, they're coexistent. For example, I'm using mythos right now. I'm talking to you. It's of the mouth. At the same time, I'm using logos by presenting it in a slideshow with words. All right. So Plato, recognizing the dangers of writing, we'll talk more about this in a minute. You find it in Egypt too, in the Egyptian mythology, with Thoth or Tooth, who is the god of writing. So what we get when we look back at Plato, who despises writing but uses it, who wants to overturn the storytelling culture of Homer, his predecessor, and whom he gives great credit, but wants to overturn, because you cannot do philosophy, you cannot do rationality, you cannot do logic in storytelling for Plato. So given that, what we have is a snapshot of transitions in culture. So when we read a myth, when we read the Bible, when we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, when we read the great Greek myths or Native American myths, what we're reading, right? The medium is the message, is the moment when it gets written down. Okay? That story, those stories have had a rich and full life before that, with many changes, many iterations, many uses, many forms, but always oral. So when you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, what you read is something that was written down, and so writing is becoming prevalent, or at least prevalent enough to write this story down. Well, that's a moment in history, but notice that we do not treat it that way. We treat it as the first moment, when in fact it's one of the last. What we find in this snapshot of the transition between orality and literacy and myth is we see just the edge of the ancient philosophies. So, for example, I teach the birth of consciousness, and I love these philosophers that are called pre-Socratics, because they are right on this seam between mythos and logos. And so they're the first philosophers, but they are poets and storytellers. They're right in the center of mythos. And so, not surprisingly, their works, the first philosophical works, are in poetic form, in verse. There are also, many of them, fragments. So we don't have the full systematic philosophies that would come much later. Even Plato doesn't use systematic philosophy. He uses dialogue, which is part of storytelling, I would argue. And we get to see culture. The cultures, just a glimpse of these cultures from the time, but only a glimpse and only at the moment of the writing. What's existed before the writing is unavailable to us because the nature of sound, that it disappears. And in an oral culture, everything's always disappearing except what can be remembered. We'll get into this in more detail shortly, but think about this. If in my first lecture, the most important point was that there is no Bible, the second most important point is this: that the Bible we have began in orality and is inaccessible to us, except at the moment it becomes written. All right. So let's get into some more detail here. So orality, the Bible begins in orality, and you can see it, and it's in fact creates all kinds of problems for interpreters because they come with literate assumptions about what the text is. But what do we mean by orality? The signature book on this subject, there are several, but the signature book is a fairly short book written in the 80s by a Jesuit named Walter Ong. And he writes this: I style the orality of a culture totally untouched by any knowledge or writing or print primary orality. It is primary by contrast with the secondary orality of present-day high-technology culture in which a new orality is sustained by telephone, radio, television, and other electronic devices that depend on their existence and functioning, for their existence and functioning on writing and print. So this was before the internet, but it still applies. Continuing, today, primary oral culture in the strict sense hardly exists, since every culture knows of writing and has some experience of its effects. Still, to varying degrees, many cultures and subcultures, even in a high technology ambiance, preserve much of the mindset of primary orality. All right, so orality still exists. Like I said, I'm using it right now, at least with this electronic medium, but it's no longer dominant. It's no longer dominant. And if it were dominant, we would think completely differently. So as Ong says, there's primary and secondary orality. He's thinking of television as secondary orality, as well as he says a new orality sustained by telephone, radio, and television. What's interesting now is I think there is a new medium, the visual medium, that we won't have time to talk about, but it's something interesting to think about. I think we've gone from orality to literacy to visuality. I think we think in images now. I'm thinking of memes, clips, photographs, and videos. All right. Now, again, you're gonna hear me repeat this because it's counterintuitive, or at least it's a strange notion that takes a while to come through. Orality is one kind of knowing. Literacy is another. Completely, well, I hate the word complete. It's very different. And we're going to get into details of why. The nature of knowledge is the nature of communication. The medium is the message or the meaning. All right. So let's get into these granular differences that I've been hinting at. And it has to do largely with sound. And you're going to hear me reading some from Walter Ong's book, Orality and Literacy. First of all, understand that the nature of sound is evanescent. All right. The nature of sound itself, I mean, listen, when I say evanescent, by the time I get to the syllable scent, the first two syllables, evan, are gone. They're gone. I mean, they're right there on the slide, but that's literacy, right? If you close your eyes and hear me say evanescent, sound is embedded in time, and time passes. And so meaning passes. It's like breath, right? And this is actually a common metaphor in oral cultures, is that words are breath. And metaphorically, words are made of you. Words come out of you and are made of breath. It's the very notion of inspiration. Is that word means to breathe, or it's related to the word breathe. Ong writes this: there's no way to stop sound and have sound. I can stop a moving picture camera and hold one frame fixed on the screen. If I stop the movement of sound, I have nothing, only silence, no sound at all. All sensation takes place in time, but no other sensory field totally resists a holding action, stabilization, in quite this way. Vision can register motion, but it can also register immobility. Indeed, it favors immobility, for to examine something closely by vision, we prefer to have it quiet. We often reduce motion to a series of still shots the better to see what that motion is. There is no equivalent of a still shot for sound. All right. So he continues, Ong does, for anyone who has a sense of what words are in a primary oral culture, or at least a culture not far removed from primary orality, it is not surprising that the Hebrew term dabar means word and event. Word and event, because words are events in oral cultures. Moreover, words cannot be frozen in time. Try to stop a word and you have silence. Try to stop an image or a video. Try to stop a video and you have an image. Try to stop a spoken word, you have silence. Nothing. And that's because sound is an event. It's an event. It's a happening in the world. And in an oral culture, it's not surprising that there is a power associated with it, an extreme power, in fact, a creative power. So words are made of breath, and they come out of us as inspiration, as breathing, um, related to the word respiration. Their power is creative. They're events. They make things happen in the world. And we can go straight to the book of Genesis in its orality to see that, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So you see, what sounds like in print, in a literate culture, a kind of superstition or at least some quaint notion is anything but that in an oral culture. God said, let there be light, and there was light. He spoke it into existence. The universe, the cosmos, was spoken into existence by the word. And we, humans, speak things into existence by our words. So naming is a kind of creation and power. And we can see this not just in ancient Hebrew culture, we can see it in Native American cultures where it is often proscribed to speak the names of the dead. We see it in sub-Saharan African indigenous cultures as well. Be careful speaking the names of the dead because you call them back. Words have that much power. All the more power because they are evanescent. They come and go. They are easily lost, right? So in such an oral culture, because they're easily lost, you know only what you can recall. You know only what you can remember. If it's not remembered, it's gone. Because remember, there's no writing, there are no lists, there are no books, there are no libraries, there are no devices. If something is forgotten by a person or a culture, it's gone. Not gone in the sense of hidden, like literally disappeared. There is no way to find it again. And so, again, not surprisingly, in ancient Hebrew culture, such as in the book of Deuteronomy, you have this urgent commandment to tell the story and pass it on. Tell the story of Moses and the Exodus. Pass it on. Tell the story of what God, Yahweh, which we could never speak aloud, by the way, because it's too powerful. Tell that story over and over again. Pass it on. That's, again, appears to us in literate culture as something quaint or poetic or aspirational, when in fact it's basic survival for an oral culture. If it's gone, it's gone. Well, how do you remember things? Well, they're actually formulas, tactics, practices that help you do this. For example, you think memorable thoughts. So you tell a good story, basically. You tell a good story, and you tell it using um, mnemonic devices. And so, again, we're talking about poetry. So, not surprising that the pre Socratic philosophers would write in poetry, because poetry puts orality into memorable forms. So, we think of rhyme as, again, some decoration, some Baroque addition to language. But in an oral culture, it's not. It is how you remember. The story of the Odyssey and the Iliad was told by the great singers, and it was put into hexameter, 6 beats per measure, to help you remember it. You need a form, you need a container for these words to help you remember. There are all kinds of devices here: rhythm, rhyme. In fact, let's get into it. So they're formulaic. So, for example, you never talk about the vine or the oak. You say the clinging vine, the sturdy oak, right? So you add up adjectives before the noun to help you record your culture's notion of what is, right? So if the oak is always sturdy, then I can be like an oak, sturdy. And you see it resonates throughout the culture. The clinging vine. I remember my father, who was in the Navy in World War II, used to say, repeat this saying: red in the morning, sailor's warning; red at night, sailor's delight. Right? These formulas, often including rhyme and adjectives to build up around the words to remember them. And I think now all you got to do is look at the Bible, and you'll see this everywhere. And it again, it comes to us as strange in a literate culture, and it makes reading the Bible odd at times, because why are they talking about this? For example, in the Psalms are constructed, they're songs, and they're poetry. So they're Hebrew poetry, and Hebrew poetry is very different than what we're used to, in that you state one line and then you repeat the idea in the next line. Why do that? Modern poets wouldn't do that because it's repetitive. Well, you want repetition in an oral culture. You want that a lot, because that's how you remember. All right. So, what's called for in an oral culture is its own kind of intelligence, right? Could you sing the Odyssey to an audience? I don't think so. I know I couldn't. There's a kind of memory, there's a kind of intelligence that comes from memory. There's a creativity. Did they sing the Odyssey the same way every time? No, because it's oral. It's not a list. It's not a document. It's a living, breathing story. And so creativity is allowed, as well as sophistication, where you elaborate upon a character or a plot element. That's all fine. And again, you're going to see this in the Bible. It's additive, not subordinate. So all that means is, if you know what a subordinate clause is in a sentence, it's because or since, usually. And you don't get to do that in an oral culture. That's only a product of literacy. What you get in an oral culture is like when you tell a story, and so, and so, and so. So listen to this right from the Bible. Additive, not subordinative. Listen. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was out with void and empty, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and light was made, and God saw the light. You hear all those ands? That's all on means here by additive. And so, and so, and so. It's aggregative rather than analytic. So this relates to what we were talking about before, how you put adjectives in front of nouns. So not just a soldier, but a brave soldier or a cowardly soldier. Not the princess, but the beautiful princess. Not the oak, but the sturdy oak. You've got to cluster adjectives around your nouns to help you create really a new linguistic element, right? That is a compound of these adjectives and nouns. It's redundant or copious. The ands are there not only to connect the elements of the story, but to give the speaker time to remember. If you've ever done any public speaking, you know that unless you're incredible at public speaking, and few of us are, you use words. See, I just did it. You use words as pauses while you think about what comes next, right? And so let's make that point. There's a lot of thinking going on in oral cultures. Hesitation is not usually good in an oral culture because you want to keep the flow going. Now, we use it in literate culture all the time, but for other reasons. I remember taking public speaking in college, and the rule was tell them what you're going to say it, then tell them what you said. It's right out of oral culture. Redundant, copious, fulsome. It is also conservative or traditionalist. Conservative in the sense that you must conserve what you know, right? So if there's a spring on the north side of the mesa, you need to pass that on if you're going north for the winter hunt or for the winter hibernation, for the winter camp. If you need to go north for the winter, you need to know there's a spring on the north side of the mesa because you're going to need water. So you need to hold on to that. That's all that conservative means, is to conserve that information, right? And this is what interests me the most, honestly, is how different logic and thinking is. Not logic, but, well, there is a logic here, but thinking is in the oral world. There is a lot of thinking going on. It's just not the kind of thinking we recognize as thought. And again, the medium is the meaning. The medium is the message. So what appears to us as rational does not appear to people in oral cultures as rational. In fact, it appears kind of dumb. All right. So orality is close to the human life world. So, for example, if it's January, let's say it's January in the northern hemisphere. Let's say it's January on the northern plains in the United States. What does the word January mean? I don't know. I mean, it has to do with Janus, the Roman god, which has nothing to do with the northern plains, right? And I understand that I have to read about it. I understand that Janus is the two-faced gods, looking back on the year, okay, that all makes sense, but it makes no sense on the northern plains. You know what makes sense on the northern plains in January? Moon of the popping trees. It's the month when it gets so cold that the trees pop. Now, if you've ever camped in the northern plains in January, as I have, that's a visceral description close to the human life world of what actually happens, right? And then the spring is the moon of the cherry blossoms or something like that. It doesn't matter. The point is that it's not related to a culture far removed. It's related to your life on the Northern Plains or wherever. It's agonistically and honorifically toned. So all that means is, these are Ong's terms, Walter Ong's terms. And all it means is there's a struggle. So Book of Job has this great line: as soon as someone is born, the sparks begin to fly. Sure enough, because life is a struggle. And so in oral cultures, this is embedded. In literate cultures, some literate cultures, it can be repressed, ignored, in favor of idealism. You don't get idealism in an oral culture. You get only the life world. You get the popping trees. So orality values and situates knowledge within this struggle, right? As a way not to be cool or to look smart, but to survive, right? So these proverbs, for example, are not just niceties. They're absolutely elements for survival in a world where the sparks are always flying. They're also empathetic and participatory rather than objectively distanced. Let me let Ong explain this as I quote him here. He writes, "Writing separates the knower from the known, and thus sets up conditions for objectivity, in quotation marks, in the sense of personal disengagement or distancing. The objectivity which Homer and other oral performers do have is that enforced by formulaic expression that we just talked about. Continuing with Ong, the individual's reaction is not expressed as simply individual or subjective, but rather as encased in the communal reaction. All right, so the communal soul. So again, objectivity is not scientific objectivity. It's objectivity that takes you out of yourself." Continuing, under the influence of writing, despite his protest against it, Plato had excluded the poets from his Republic, for studying them was essentially learning to react with soul, to feel oneself identified with Achilles or Odysseus. You see the difference? It's enormous, absolutely enormous. Homeostatic, meaning you try to keep things the same because things are always changing, right? There's a kind of double movement in oral cultures that the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin calls the monologic and the dialogic, where things move toward the center because we have to stop the world in order to survive. We have to say, okay, this means this for now, but it's always for now in an oral culture, because you're also open. Bakhtin calls it an open totality to change in the world. Now, just think about that element in relation to the Bible. Open totality, open to change, trying to move inward toward a centripetal understanding, but always being pulled away from that by the centrifugal forces of the world. All right, situational rather than abstract. This is my favorite. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories here, some more true stories. So and Ong mentions this, there was a anthropologist who studied oral cultures in the early 20th century. Milman Perry, I believe was his name. And these were in Siberia. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let me just tell you a couple of stories that are so relevant and interesting. These Perry and his researchers were trying to understand the differences between oral and literate ways of thinking. So they brought literate constructs to these oral cultures and asked people to the oral peoples if they could understand them. One simple one was, can you define a tree? And one of the oral participants said, you don't know what a tree is? Again, situated in the human life world, no abstractions. So I don't know how to think about a tree except in my experience of the trees. And they used a syllogism. Now, the syllogism is simply a little three-part argument, the most famous of which is, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. All right, you see how that works? It's a general premise, a specific premise, and then a conclusion. So they gave a syllogism to one of these oral participants in their study, and they said, in Nova Zembla, an area in the Arctic, all the bears are white. There's a bear in Nova Zembla. What color is the bear? And the participant said, I don't know. I've never been to Nova Zembla. I've never been to Nova Zembla. How can I know if I haven't experienced it? Right? So notice what writing does. Writing will lift you out of your context into an abstraction. Orality will not let you do that. And then finally, obviously, heroes and villains play an important part. Sorry, that's not finally on this slide. Heroes and villains play an important part because they help you navigate the world. This is good, this is bad, right? Be like him, don't be like her. And then sight isolates, sound incorporates. Incredibly important, right? Incredibly significant root level change in human culture. Sight isolates, writing isolates, sound incorporates. Incorporates quite literally, because sound is coming out of the body and going into the body. Coming out in my breath and through my larynx, and coming into my body through vibrations in my ear. Moreover, I have to be near you to hear you. I cannot participate in language unless you're with me, which means that orality is community. It makes no sense to not function in community in an oral culture. Now, that's not a romantic or idealistic notion. That's simply true, that I cannot participate in language if you're on the next mesa over and can't hear me. Right? But given that, community becomes the default setting, because what other setting would there be, right? And so community becomes life. Writing is the opposite of community because sight isolates. If I'm lecturing in a hall and I've handed out a paper or a handout or something, and I ask the audience to read what's on that handout, immediately they all become isolated individuals. When I ask them to look up and listen to me again, we are now in community because we're in orality. When they look down, they're in literacy. When they listen, they're in orality. So what are these conclusions here? Enormous, significant, paradigm-shifting conclusion. Writing restructures consciousness. Writing restructures consciousness. All right, so I've been hinting at this all along, though I've been talking about orality mostly. When we adopted writing, about 2500 BCE, it varies, let's say several thousand years ago, when we adopted writing as a species, first of all, it took a long time for it to permeate all the cultures of the world, and was first adopted by the elite, specifically the priests. Um, Writing restructures consciousness because now what? You don't have to remember. You can write it down. And so you freed up your memory for other things. And this was Plato's complaint. And it's also the complaint from the Egyptian myth is that writing destroys memory, and it does. It does. Because you don't need it. You can write something down instead of remembering it. Now, you would think that there might be a potential there for memory to flourish. In fact, what seems to be the case is that it atrophies rather than flourishes. I don't know if you can relate to that. I certainly can. But writing restructures consciousness. I think now of meaning in writing, in literacy, I think of meaning as outside of me. It's on the page. It's in the book. It's in an object. It's not in me. Moreover, remember, writing isolates. And so now there's a me, right? I'm not exaggerating this. It is with the greatest advance in literacy that the individual begins to arise. The individual is a relatively new invention in human consciousness. It was always my clan, my tribe, my nation, my family. It was never just me. So how the birth of the individual is a product of writing? To some degree, yes. I would say it is. Not even to some degree, it is. Writing restructures consciousness. Consciousness. What I think of myself, what I think of my world. Remember how we started? The medium is the meaning. Writing is inhuman. It's inhuman. It's not human. Speaking is human. It involves my body, and it involves the presence of at least one other body in order for it to work. But writing is inhuman. It pretends, I don't know if pretends is the right word, but it establishes outside of the mind what in reality can only be in the mind. It is a thing. It's a manufactured product, right? And writing destroys memory. Not surprisingly, you'll see in the history of writing, there are these interesting stories, often from Native America, where indigenous peoples see writing for the first time, and they think it's a trick, which it is, but they also think it means death. But that's not just them. It's Plato says this, and it's a really interesting idea, right? This is Walter Ong. The association between writing and death is suggested in Plato's charge that writing is a human thing-like and that it destroys memory. It's also abundantly evident in countless references to writing traceable in printed dictionaries of quotations. And here's the Bible, 2 Corinthians 3:6. The letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Horace, reference to his 3 books of the Odes as a monument presaging his own death. Henry Vaughan's assurance to Sir Thomas Bodley that in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, every book is your epitaph, right? There's more of these. We have a consistent refrain in human culture that writing is associated with death. Sometimes writing kills in this phrasing, this imagination, but it is always associated with death. Writing is not natural, right? It's something invented, whereas speech may not be natural, depending on how you define natural. It is more human than writing. Writing is isolating, as we already mentioned. And writing separates the knower from the known. Writing separates the knower from the known, as opposed to an oral culture where if I cannot know something that's outside of me, I don't know what January is, but I know what popping trees are. I don't know what's in Nova Zembla, but I know what's here in front of me. I don't know what the definition of a tree is, but I know what a tree is, right? All right. So much more to say here, but let's talk for the last few minutes here about print. Now, there's a great book by Elizabeth Eisenstein called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. And if writing changes, restructures human consciousness, printing does something else. It adds to the writing's restructuring. For example, Eisenstein, this is Ong again. Eisenstein spells out in detail how print made the Italian Renaissance a permanent European Renaissance. Print, not writing, not handwriting, but print. How it implemented the Protestant Reformation, right? Almost every historian agrees that there's no Protestant Reformation without Gutenberg and his printing press, right? Because you can't say everyone can read the Bible for themselves, Luther's basic premise, without everybody having access to a Bible for themselves. It developed capitalism, implemented the Western European exploration of the globe, changed family life and politics, diffused knowledge as never before, made universal literacy a serious objective and even an accomplishment, possible accomplishment, gave rise to modern science, altered social and intellectual life. And yet, orality is tenacious. We can never give it up. And this is because it is more, put it in quotation marks, it is more natural. We cannot not do orality. We must always speak. But we do it under the dominant paradigm of literacy or print. It takes on a different form. It is no longer the dominant mode of communication. Therefore, it is not the dominant mode of thought. Print, however, locks words in place, in space. It locks them in. Are you seeing the connection to the Bible here? Print locks words in space. It makes them look permanent and objective. Hence, your interpretation of what's being printed tends toward permanence, objectivity. The inerrant word of God is a few short steps away. Print is machine made. It means it looks different than writing. Writing still has very human characteristics. My writing is terrible. It looks like an animal wrote something, but it's organic. It's natural in that sense, as opposed to what I print out on a laser printer, which is neat, tidy, blocked, justified, whatever. It moves away from the human. Print, again, makes for rapid, silent reading, much more rapid, right? So the medieval monks who were working on the manuscripts had to go slowly because they were written. Sure, you can produce beautiful calligraphy, but it's still written, difficult to read. Print, on the other hand, is consistent, uniform, and that makes the reading faster, and it means you can read silently instead of saying it out loud, for example, doing an oral version of the print that's in front of you. Obviously, now you have this other dimension, this other aspect in print where you can index and search now. I kind of, anthropologists and linguists call it the paradigmatic, where you're looking across at, instead of in time reading one thing and sequentially reading one thing after another, you can lift out and find topics and themes across that sequential line. And writing is a container, except it's not. It presents itself as a container. And again, never more relevant than to the Bible. It's not a container of those old stories. It is a transformation of those old stories, right? Though it presents itself, I'm just a container, I'm just holding this for you. When in fact, it's changing everything. It's changing the story and it's changing you. All right. There's also, of course, the digital Bibles now, giving us more and better access to the Bible. I use it all the time because sometimes I want to do this paradigmatic search. I want to know the instances in which a word or an idea appears. I don't want to read it sequentially to find out. As I say here, more paradigmatic. We're now talking about bits, not books, and that's something that's happening in our culture with the prevalence of writing and print, is that information and knowledge has exploded to the point where it's exceeded our ability to grasp it. So what happens when knowledge is like that? Consider, for example, that in the Middle Ages, a professor would know everything. I mean, everything. Doesn't matter what he or she is a professor of. That professor knows everything there is to know in the world because the knowledge that's in the world is limited. Now it's exponentially increasing well beyond, to the point where we have to have computers process this knowledge now. So it's bits more than books, and the Bible falls into that, as we saw in the last lecture, where there are things that are ignored and things that are put in the Bible that actually aren't there. What you get is less comprehension, less memory, and retrieval, and the genre becomes social media. It's a social media text now, rather than a story. It's a clip. It's a tweet, right? And that changes everything too. All right. Thank you for listening. There's lots to talk about here, and I look forward to hearing our discussions. And I guess reading our discussions. A little orality slip there. Thank you.